Welcome everyone to today's iNACOL Leadership Webinar. I'm Susan Patrick, the President and CEO of iNACOL, and I'm joined today by Brian Setzer, partner at Two Revolutions. His portfolio includes some of the most innovative organizations in higher ed and K-26. Brian revitalized and transformed the North Carolina virtual school into a national model for e-learning, serving over 50,000 students annually. As a Chief Quality Officer, I first met Brian in North Carolina when he was with Iredell Statesville Schools, and his school district was recognized as a Malcolm Baldrige National Award winner and a National Best Practice Staff Development Site by APQC. So join me in welcoming Brian Setzer to today's webinar as my co-presenter. What we're going to do today is go ahead and get started. We encourage your participation. As you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen is a chat, and that chat room allows you to enter in questions, introduce yourself, share your name, what organization you're with, and where you're joining us from. We have a global audience today, and we really appreciate you being interested in this important topic around personalized learning. The purpose of today's webinar is to really give an overview of what it takes to get started if you're interested in implementing personalized learning. That means I'm going to be citing a number of resources and tools and moving through a broad introduction rather quickly. I will be turning it over to Brian to really talk about how do we get engaged in this design? So planning, designing, implementing. The big idea is how do we design learning environments that is instructional models, teaching models, school models for how students learn best. What does the brain research tell us about how students learn best? How do we bring in that youth development theory? How do we ignite, excite, drive learning based on what we know about how the brain works? One thing we do know is that a one-size-fits-all approach to education with a single teacher and a single textbook lecturing in a fixed amount of time while students have varying amounts of learning doesn't work really well. And if we're going to really change the future of education across the globe, the move towards personalized learning environments is becoming more and more of a focus. So let's go ahead and get started. At iNACOL, we're supporting the largest active community of innovative practitioners transforming the future of learning around the globe. iNACOL is working on catalyzing practice, but also getting input, documenting best practices, informing and educating about new learning models, and helping policymakers understand what the potential is, where the barriers are, and what we can do to dramatically change systems to serve students best. So let's get started. iNACOL published in partnership with the Next Generation Learning Challenges a report called Planning and Designing for Next Generation Learning. This focuses on really looking at how we can design new models of student-centered learning with true personalization and taking advantage of those blended learning models. There are going to be several reports that I'm citing that are helpful tools that have lots of detailed guiding questions that point to a number of resources. And so really the point of this webinar is to help share with you some big ideas out of these tools and where you can find them. I'll be entering links into the chat, and this webinar will be recorded and archived and available to you after the webinar. So this resource, Planning and Designing for New Learning Models, starts with 5 steps. Number 1, we have found that K-12 education, as they try to design and get started in personalized learning, need to first help their own communities think about what next generation learning looks like and what kinds of personalized learning do they want to see occur in their own communities and environments. So the first step is really understanding next generation learning. The second step is around planning and managing for change. The third step is around the design, understanding your goals for students. What are the elements and the design elements that you want to adopt, and how are you going to engage in that continuous improvement of your program once you get started? The fourth step is around engaging the planning team and building across diverse stakeholders. So how do we help our educators, our teacher leaders become learning engineers and designers of these new personalized learning models? Across your community, what other organizations, third-party organizations, what individuals, what policy leaders do you need to authentically engage around the vision and next steps? And are you starting with students and parents in the community and across your school system or your network or your environment? The fifth step is reviewing additional tools and resources and knowing where you can go next to dig deeper. So on each of these, I'm going to touch on some of the big ideas, but mostly focused on understanding new learning models, these next generation learning models, and how personalization fits together. So let's start. There are differences and commonalities in these big concepts and big ideas that are important to understand in order to protect the quality when you're implementing. So let's start with this. The big goal is really around personalization. It's about creating learning environments that aren't just flexibly paced, although that may be an element of personalization, but really focus on per person. If you have a group of 20 students or 30 students, how do you best meet each student's individual needs, interests, passions, meet them where they are in their zone of proximal development in the learning cycle, and bring in a range of content resources, instructional support to ensure that every student is successful. This big idea around personalization, which is mapped to empowering educators to have the tools that they need to construct learning environments that best serve students based on how students learn best. So around this big idea of personalization are competency education, which is when students advance upon mastery, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these big concepts, and also blended learning as a driver, as a delivery system to help personalize that instruction. This big idea around personalized learning at its core is about tailoring learning for each student's strengths, needs, and interests. And this includes student agency, enabling student voice and choice in what they learn, how they learn, when and where they learn, providing flexibility and supports. And supports are critical to ensure mastery of the highest standards possible. So this idea around per person having tailored learning experiences. But we dig in to the relationship between the research internationally and how students learn best and how that maps to personalized learning in this iNACOL report called Mean What You Say, Defining and Integrating Personalized, Blended, and Competency Education. This report was developed to really help school leaders, teacher leaders understand the big ideas and what they could do to get started in planning and designing. Now, how does competency education fit with this? The core of competency-based education is that all students are held to the same high standards, and students advance to the next lesson or the next standard upon demonstrated mastery. These competencies are explicit, they're clear, students know their learning goals, and they're empowered by them. This is what I need to be able to know and be able to do and to be able to show. And students are demonstrating this mastery through some kind of a performance with evidence. When they are assessed, they either know that they have reached proficiency, reached mastery, or they need to try again to further build and develop those skills. They don't reach mastery, they get immediate support and differentiated support based on their needs. And this idea of competency-based education includes not only academic skills, but academic plus core competencies like 21st century skills, social, emotional, and skills and dispositions they need to be successful in later life. So think about them as personalization as the overall system goal as compared to a one-size-fits-all factory model. Competency education is really a structural foundation designed to ensure that students are learning and progressing and successful. That is, they don't have huge holes or gaps in learning. They are in a competency-based structure. They cannot be grade levels behind because the focus is on ensuring every student hits mastery and has success and letting learning be the constant and time be the variable. So in personalized learning, we're meeting each student's needs and we're giving them instructional opportunities that may have different pathways and may have different supports to be successful. So when you think about blended learning, it's really an instructional delivery system. It's using both online and face-to-face, and it can help enable competency education with far more data about how students are doing, and it can help personalize learning in providing a range of additional digital content resources and instructional resources. We'll talk a little bit more about the individual ideas on blended learning and how this fits in too. But when we think about the starting point, getting started for personalized learning, it really does include defining the learner's goals and being able to understand the learner's prior knowledge and competence. So you have to start by saying, what are the standards and the goals that we hope to achieve? And that includes those academic standards and also the competencies and skills. Next, you need to be able to assess competencies. Where is that student coming in on their academic level, on their learning trajectory? What are those learner interests? What are those learner styles? What kinds of deeper learning do students want to engage in? Step 3 is around really focusing on the learner needs and developing a plan. And step 4 is evaluating this competency progress in real time. So at the core of that is a learner profile. At the core of personalized learning, you really need to have a learner profile for every student. Some people call these personalized learning maps. Others call them student passports or portfolios. But this big idea is around a learner portfolio. So how does blended learning really fit into this? Well, you can expand learning opportunities through online and blended learning. You can have classroom blended learning and mobile learning. Michael Horn and Heather Staker's definition of blended learning is 3 parts, which I think are really important. This is not just technology integration. You're talking about when a student learns at least in part through online learning with some element of control over time, path, or pace, or place. So there can be this flexibility, and it's at least at part in a supervised location, such as school. And this is critical. The modalities along each student's learning path within a subject are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. So Heather Staker has provided this graphic image of blended learning is not just putting laptops on every desktop when kids are still in rows learning the same exact thing at the same exact time. And it's not just putting an electronic whiteboard at the front of the classroom. The idea is really around modularizing through the use of effective and advanced technologies the ability for each student to move away from that one-size-fits-all model and get empowered to have access to different content resources, access to data in real time to help inform what they need to work on, what they need to do next. And this core idea that online learning is inherently modular, so that once you fill in those gaps and can take different pathways, you can accelerate, or a student can accelerate, catch up, and advance. So with that, we look across the country at those that have gotten started with using blended learning to better personalize instruction. And in California, you have Los Altos schools that are using Khan Academy to pinpoint where students are in their math trajectory, help empower these students become active learners. Some of these students want to use other digital content resources that are tied more to their interests, and have teachers empowered with tools that help them become activators of learning. So it's not facilitation just on the side, but it's really using that data every day to activate the learning, to personalize learning for every student. So the research on blended learning is pointing to these changing roles of the educators. That teachers are becoming conductors. A classroom is like an orchestra where students may be in slightly different instruments with different interests, with different sounds, with different tones. But pulling that together, allowing different pacing within a carefully constructed set of scales, having teachers become learning designers, coaches, concierge of different content and materials. So this monitors of progress, graduation coaches, and really activating the learning is what the research is telling us can dramatically improve outcomes. This idea of empowering students and having teachers empowered to help maximize and optimize an instructional model through personalization. So across the country, across the world, we see this personalization taking place with having students be creators of knowledge. These students are part of the maker movement. They're doing project and inquiry-based learning to help do a STEM project across different subject matter. They're meeting different standards in science and math, even engineering and technology. They're using 21st century skills by doing the research on how to build and construct this. There are, and they can pick projects that interest them. They will, after they build it, create a video and develop language arts skills and how they tell the story of their project and hit on key standards. So let's think about what looks different in this blended learning environment and think about the changes that you might see here. Here are some blended learning models from around the globe. You see that there's no real desks and rows or teacher standing, lecturing in the front of the classroom. You have a lot of small group work. You have a lot of students engaged in different content at different times. But time matters. When we focus on competency-based learning as a foundation, it's about time-based targets so that we're ensuring equity and we're ensuring that students are meeting the highest standards possible. There may be some flexibility in how you use time, how you use resources, but that is all to help empower a more personalized learning experience that makes sure all students are successful. This is a middle school in Denver, Colorado, Grant Beacon, and you have students on both sides of a very flexible open classroom working across 8 or 10 different standards depending on where they are. They're getting supports. They're very clear about the goals that they're working on. They're developing through a performance evidence of their learning, and they're using an exit ticket before they move on to the next lesson. Here's another example of a model of the personalized blended learning in Minnesota, where you have students that are working on their own individual projects and assignments. Around the outside of the room, you have groups of students in small breakout conference rooms and tables working on projects. But this looks much more like the modern workplace that these students are likely to be entering in the next few years when they go and graduate and go into the workplace or go into their careers, go into college life. So thinking about how this personalization from the learning environment and their space to how instruction is delivered is key. So you have these students in a middle school working on their own science standards, designing their own projects. Let's say teachers become co-designers with these students of here's the standard, here's the learning goal, and how do I want to learn this? What content am I going to use? So when we think about planning, we think about content, resources, thinking about standards alignment up front to help empower teachers and students to have access to these resources. And this is Summit High School in one of the Summit schools in California, and you have students that are working on their daily goals in different places, in different subject areas. What I love about this is that they learn, and then when they're ready to show what they know, assessment's always open. There are tables, there are teachers, there are people and adults surrounding them that are ready and available when they're ready to be assessed. So you show what you know, and assessment is always open. So this is one of the last examples here, but USC Hybrid High School. When they first opened and students came in a few years ago into the 9th grade, there was an adaptive assessment that was provided to be able to find out what their academic knowledge was in math. And as it turns out, the schools that they were matriculating from, with a range of grades on their report card, they found that most students were at a 4th or 5th grade level, that this range of students was from 1st grade all the way to 9th grade. And when you think about truly personalizing learning, this is key to know where a student is academically when they come in, and be very honest about that and work with that student to fill in those gaps. So what USC Hybrid High did was have a series of very difficult conversations with parents and students about really the data and where students were, and talked about it as, if you dip your toe into a river, it's never in the same place twice. Using that analogy, understanding that truly all students are at a different place when they come in, and that the school needs to be organized to support those students to catch up and accelerate, and to bring them up so they can get back on track. This idea of constant check-ins, constant support, but being very honest so that students are empowered with understanding where they are and what they need to be successful. Teachers are empowered with the tools to be able to have the information, but be able to activate on that, doing what's right for students, and to be able to use, again, the research on how students learn best is key. So these are some examples in a truly personalized learning environment. You may have lots of paper, you may have lots of technology, you may have more paper and less technology, you may have more technology and less paper, but this is not about technology itself. This is really about designing the learning environment. So if a student needs to be able to meet this English language art learning goal to explain how a story's plot unfolds, to be able to describe how specific events cause the character to change, you see, a student can choose whatever text that they want to, that interests their own passion, to be able to design how they're going to learn that, what content they're going to learn that with, and how they're going to demonstrate that at a high level. And this is the idea that's core behind personalization. One, students have voice and choice in how they learn and how they're going to demonstrate that learning, and they have agency around their learning. And number two, that they're advancing based on competency. That is, they are demonstrating mastery before they move forward. These are key. Examples of students' best work is also critical. That evidence that students must provide in their own personalized learning pathway, and being able to produce an e-portfolio or a portfolio of evidence is really important. So these are some of the big ideas. If this S-curve is algebra, and there are lots of different applications for how you can learn those core skills, finding a way to design the learning environment and plan so that students can learn in different ways and also get support and do that moving along the trajectory may not be linear, and that's okay, but you're building on those pathways and ensuring there are no gaps. While this may look complicated, it's actually, we know how students learn, and we're just trying to create these environments. And now we have the technology to make it manageable and to give them choices like never before. This is real empowerment for each student's needs. So there are ways that you can get started where you're not biting all of this off at once. You think about the design choices that you're making and the context, what your design principles are, co-design with students, really be clear around the research, around how students learn, the learning sciences and youth development. Think about what it means for you, your community, your school, your teachers, your students to personalize learning and what the goals are. Start with the goals and the values and the vision. And when you think about how can we really personalize learning, I know that there are these new technologies out there. Just because a piece of software or an online learning tool or platform has the term personalization stamped on it for its marketing purposes, because it has flexible pacing, that does not necessarily mean it's truly creating a personalized learning environment, okay? This is a core, I think, issue and challenge of our field. Personalized pacing using technology can be helpful for personalized learning, so flexible pacing, that could be an element. But true personalization means multiple pathways, voice and choice in those pathways, different ways of demonstrating that knowledge, and ensuring true mastery through a performance. So when you think and you look at adaptive technologies, ask yourself, to what end? Is this a technology that helps me when kids come into class do leveling? So before these technologies, it was really hard to know where each of your students was in a group of 20 students to say, oh, they're at this lexile level, or this student's at a higher lexile level, and we need to adapt to their needs, or what level are they in math. So that's key. Another way that we think about adaptive technologies are completely different, and that can be to provide real-time scaffolding or in-course corrections. Another way that technology that's adaptive, and these are different adaptive technologies, is to create limitless pathways. So the next sequential piece on the pathway or their learning progression is provided. And then last, if you think about adaptive technologies, recommendation engines are a really helpful adaptive technology. While our system might recommend a piece of content or content objects either based on their performance or their interest. So while something might be stamped with flexible pacing, or a piece of software might be stamped with adaptive, think about how that fits into the overall design. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian here soon and just like flow through what some of the other big ideas in the resources and reports that we've published on planning and managing change is the next step. You think about the different elements in planning and managing change, and that's adaptive leadership. It's a different leadership style. What kinds of professional development can you provide that is also personalized for the adults in the system? How do you think about the changes in teaching and instructional practices? What are the operational changes, administrative systems and policies? Calendars, schedules, traditional pacing guides can really lock down our way of thinking around what's possible for students anytime, any place. How are you going to organize content resources and make available additional resources? And the technology infrastructure is not the focus, but it's actually crucial as a supporting infrastructure for doing personalized learning. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just point out that the reports that we've released have a number of big ideas around these topics that you can dig further into for leadership, professional development, instructional practice, management systems and policy, content selection, technology support. So there are some planning guides and calendars that can help identify the questions that need to be asked in these different areas. And this is based on a case study across 10 different schools that were documented over time. So in an effort to share best practices, developed some rubrics around blended learning to try to get to this ultimate goal of personalization. Some recommendations around how you think about how you're going to calibrate proficiency, how you're going to advance students based on demonstrated mastery, and how you design your supports for not yet proficient. What happens? So how do you apply this knowledge, and how do you really rethink a personalized learning model? So when we see leaders getting started, they might start with some case studies, and Brian's done a tremendous amount of work with a number of schools, joint network meetings. Hopefully you'll be joining us at the iNACOL conference, the iNACOL symposium this November in Florida. Learning from others online and doing site visits. Level setting the terminology is incredibly important, and that's why I spent so much time on it today. So think about how you're going to address professional development and the human capital pipeline in your own systems, develop and identify supportive policy, and engage your community to help build public will. This is a big shift in what learning looks like for students and parents, and engaging in conversations with your community is really critical. And the big question is, what do we want our students to know and be able to do, and how do we get there? So with that, iNACOL has published blended teaching competencies. So for designing for next generation learning around all of these elements, knowing what it looks like with every student with a personalized learning map, engaging your planning team and your stakeholders in design workshops, and then knowing where you can find additional resources and tools. And at iNACOL, we're happy to help point you in the right direction when you have questions. So with that big, fast overview on getting started with personalized learning, I would like to turn it over to Brian Setzer, who's done an incredible amount of work on personalized learning and digging into this design and getting started. Brian, thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Really appreciated the opening comments and glad to be with everybody today. One of the things, now that you have a really good sense of frameworks and also approaches and strategies to begin your change management and leadership work, that I'd like to go in deeper on is the issue of design. And I think what we often do with design is we try to figure out how we're going to get it done. And so every one of you on this webinar is in an organization that is living in the world that you have to improve. And that is complete with regulations and standardization and legalities and, you know, trying to stay out of the newspaper. Like, I totally get it. Yet, if you're not trying to hop on that next curve of design where you get intentional by participating in webinars like today, where you're actually learning what's out there. And then from a webinar today, if you can make that stakes in the ground decision to experiment and then to begin to prototype, you will be on your way to transforming your school or your organization. But if you continue to say that you don't have enough time, you don't have enough budget, these are barriers that everybody goes through. I mean, heck, you know, I want to go to Bermuda every week, but I've got dental bills and I've got, you know, situations in my family that require innovation. So innovation is not always new or different. It's really about doing things better. You know, it's not that new is better or different is better, it's better is better. So if you can look at a lot of those examples that Susan shared and some of the pictures and think about, well, how could we experiment with some of these approaches? How could we look at some of these resources and think differently? I think what you're going to find is that design does matter. You know, we live in an era where a lot of people think design thinking is sticky notes on a wall, and we had this great meeting and, you know, maybe nothing came from it. But that's not actually how design works. I mean, the picture you're looking at here is from the University of Pittsburgh. And on the left, from about 2004 to 2010, every child that was under 12 who went through that MRI, 80% of them had to be sedated. So University of Pittsburgh reached out to the design firm IDEO and they started talking to customers. Imagine that. How do you personalize? Step one is talk to students, talk to teachers, learn what they're experiencing. And in this particular example, patients, families said that the MRI was scary and that they would design it differently. So from 2010 on, the MRIs at the University of Pittsburgh for students under 12, or for kids under 12 rather, less than 1% have to be sedated. Now, do you think that saved them money? Do you think that helped with patient care and resources? You better believe it. So how do we take those types of examples from across the space, this is a medical example, and start to think differently of how we begin to talk to students and faculty? Well, leadership has to do three things, right? They've got to learn. Folks, if you're a leader and you're walking around the school with a walkie-talkie, or you're, you know, dipping in and out of professional learning meetings, you are not modeling learner-in-chief. That's not what that means. You need to roll up your sleeves and learn with your team. And then you need to build together the future you seek, and then you need to measure it. And then once you measure it, you start learning again. So we take a lot of our approach from Lean Startup Design, those of you that have read that work. And I think where people get hung up is, you know, they think this is about a product or a business or some sort of revenue model. Folks, this can be a lean startup cycle for a grant. It can be a lean startup model for doing your scheduling differently so you can optimize time to personalize. It can be a lean startup model where you talk about new ways of professional learning. We are all probably reading the recent report that professional learning is very expensive, and we're not seeing all kinds of gains and value from it, right? So if you think about the New Teacher Project and others, we've got to get stronger at action research. We've got to get more focused on very quickly learning what our customers need. You know, we've got a real problem in education where we tend to do an autopsy on the school, not really a diagnosis or not really a preventative step in how we personalize. So we take a lot of these tactics at Two Revolutions and we help people do 4 things. You know, we like to go in and discover what people are working on and, you know, what drives them and what their passions are, what are their pain points. But most specifically, what problem are they trying to solve? Because once you have that identified, you can help them plan and prototype. You can help them build some of these great examples that Susan shared, and I'm certainly going to go deep into a couple of ours. And then ultimately, it's about implementing and, you know, sustaining, right? I mean, that's a big part of the deal. So as you think about, you know, a couple of really deep examples, I always jump on these webinars or speak in public and people say, Brian, you didn't have an elementary example, right? So I wanted to kick off with that and make sure that we started K-6 first, right, for the folks on the call. I think you've got to help people create a vision. You know, we went into this school in New Hampshire called Parker Varney, which was one of the worst in New Hampshire 2 years ago. And we started talking about, you know, what you're thinking about in terms of your big rocks. Are you trying to make your school student-centered? Are you trying to work on time and tech? And how do we mow those barriers down? And we also talked about the dispositions we wanted for kids and teachers. They needed to be problem solvers, risk takers. They needed to make sure that they were respectful to each other and there was a love of learning. So personalization is not just about technology, it's about dispositions, it's about skills and knowledge that, you know, cut across the issues of how we work and collaborate with each other and what we're learning from our students. And so some of the examples at Parker Varney that we worked on, and I'll provide you this video at the end, we're helping them really work through a 7-stage process on how they were going to do blended learning, how they were going to do competency-based assessment, how they were going to do personalized learning. And it was really about defining their needs, which Susan talked a lot about, experimenting and saying we're going to learn quickly. And you know what? If we fail, failure is some of the greatest lessons. So let's name that and let's fail forward and prioritize what we're learning together. So I think as we got deeper into this work, we started seeing, you know, sort of proof of impact. We saw students redesigning the lunch and running things out of the lunchroom in terms of a better customer experience. We saw first graders actually experimenting with 3D printers and setting up, you know, short prototypes to do things very differently. And certainly project-based learning in some very compelling ways. So at the end of this website, when I give you the video links, try to think of it as we all have been through mind-numbing school improvement planning processes. Don't do that. Pick 3 big things you want to prototype that would really change the odds for kids and shorten the time it takes to get that done. You know, there's never been a student ever who said, just give me more PD and I'll be ready to go. But as adults, we have such an aversion to saying, let's just try it and chart what we learn and chart what we can build and how we can measure things together. So what we found out in the 2 years that we've been working at Parker Varney is that attendance rates have improved, dropout rates have improved, transition has improved, our academic gains are going up, not only on metrics of the floor like standardized testing, but on cognitive skills and things we want to see like grit and resilience. And I think when you go deep into the school over 2 years, the amazing part is this year they won School of the Year. So from basically one of the very bottom 5% in the state to also within 2 years moving to the top recognized award winner for most improved, you know, what happened? Well, collectively they designed their own future. Students had prototype teams, so did teachers. So when you think about that as a deep elementary example, and you say, well, what would that look like? You know, how could kids participate in design loops? How do kids provide feedback and judge ideas by teachers? How do students work on maker activities on the 3D printer to solve challenges that the school has? A lot of it is about believing putting students in the center will personalize learning. So do they have technology there and one-to-one laptops? They're getting close, but it's not about doing worksheets on a laptop with low level of rigor or cognitive demand. It's about asking students to do things like collaborate across 6 laptops and edit each other's design, provide feedback on it. So you teach them to model the very things that you want scientists to do in the field, using probes to test hypotheses out in a nearby stream and bringing that data back and letting, elementary kids chart out on a wall what they're learning. If you put students at the center of design, great things happen. Technology is an enabler for that, but it's not the only way to get that done. When we transition to our work in secondary, one of the things that I wanted to highlight for you was a project we're working on called Davidson Next. Now, this is an example of what happens when higher ed, a large school district, a foundation, an organization like College Board, and our team as designers get together to think about what's possible, to hop on that yellow curve. And what if all these players got together on a platform like edX and said, let's do an experiment. Let's see if, 3 courses which have given high school students fits, AP Physics, AP Calculus, AP Macroeconomics, could be given in a modular way. And what if we focused on those modules for high-quality video, interactive tools, and assessment tools, and just gave people the toughest concepts in macroeconomics, like how would you like to learn just a module on the Phillips curve because you need it for the AP test or because you need it for your AP course. So the concept here was to pilot this for a year and prototype it in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools and then release it to the nation for free about a month ago for full MOOC access and also full modular access. So any student, any parent that's struggling with concept, let alone course, can work in a blended fashion. So what we've done with this particular treatment is we haven't just filmed people as talking heads. We've filmed great professors and teachers actually doing the experiment so that students can watch a 3-minute video or teachers can learn from a 3-minute video on how to teach a particular concept. We've partnered with several coding companies to develop interactive tools within the text of the website or within the examples that you can manipulate and run different experiments on. This is an example of AP Physics and a rotational model. The next slide is an example of a diagram where we talk about drop-down inline. So these are tough concepts, right? And they're assessed on the AP test, but you need to visualize them for folks and let them unlearn and relearn so that kids have opportunities to just learn in bite-sized chunks. We are all competing for the attention span of children these days. They are a mobile environment. They are texting nonstop. But here's the thing. Don't get wrapped up in the false narrative of technology is either evil or awesome. Really make an effort to teach people how to balance how they learn from one another, how they personalize their interactions and relationships, and also when to empower technology to make their lives easier, to make their lives more connected, and to collaborate in ways that we never even dreamed possible. I think when we think about Davidson Next, I certainly put the URL here for you, and you can share this with your school systems or your districts because it's all free and the project is already launched. We're getting great user uptake. People are learning how to teach in a blended way. They're also learning great things on our pilot exits from the summer and some of the Charlotte students. This fall, students will interact with the content for the first time. I think if I'm going back to the diagram on the 2 circles where we talk about where you are now, and where you would like to be. I would start by learning about these videos. I would copy down the URLs and the bit.lys. I would start to think about, how that intersects with three big ideas. Personalization is about time, talent, and tech. Everybody on this webinar needs more time. Guess what? People have schedules to give you that. You can research companies like Amplify, who run a division called School by Design. You can look at schools like Generation Schools in Colorado. You can look at Public Impact in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I'm from. And you can start to look at these schedules to give your teachers time for PD and to give you the time to sit down and think about how to use those schedules differently with kids. I think when you think about technology, you've heard a lot of talk about the types of authentic experiences Susan and I appreciate and the types of experiences that are just low level and not, higher up on revised Bloom's or any of the taxonomies that we're using is critical. I noticed in the chat that somebody's referencing SAMAR. Absolutely. I go to schools around the country, and the first thing that I ask is, what are the students doing? And if all they're doing is something that could be done in the face-to-face, that's a wasted bimodal opportunity. Teachers shouldn't be doing two things, and neither should students. But if you're giving them experiences that are really unique so that the technology can empower the types of careers we're going to see tomorrow, like coders and data visualizers and people that have to make sense of technology. I mean, heck, even my car is no longer serviced by people that are just great with a wrench. They have to understand information and analyze it in different ways. And then finally, as you go out and design your own futures, don't forget about my comments about leading with design. You should spend, before you ever initiate any kind of design or prototype, no more than a couple of weeks listening, interviewing, and getting a sense of what your users need and want. And from there, you begin to iterate and design. I wish you nothing but the best on your personalized learning journey. I'm happy to share these examples through these videos today and also in the chat or resources. I think we're going to now open the floor for questions, both on the macro view and diving deeper a little bit on these examples.
Brian, thank you so much. That was riveting. I always learn from your presentations and just appreciate so much you spending time with us today. For everyone who's joined us, please feel free to type in questions. I have seen a few here, and some of them have been answered very nicely by other participants in this collaborative session today at the webinar. Mohammed had a question. I'm still finding it difficult to understand how practical projects are in blended and personalized learning. So I'd like to give an example for this, and Brian, feel free to jump in. And Dina, you are going to have access to the slides in the webinar and the archive later. So I know we've moved through this quite quickly, but we're happy to make those available so you can go back if you need to or share with others. So this idea of how practical projects are in blended and personalized learning, I use one example. If a student has a number of standards that they need to meet in, say, language arts, in mathematics, in science, and in terms of personalized learning, they're truly interested in alternative energy. And there happens to be in their community a government agency installing new modern windmills to help produce clean energy. So in blended learning, they could get access after designing with the learning goals how they're going to do this with their teacher. The student would really be empowered to use blended learning, use the technology to identify content resources and conduct research and pull together a number of ideas related to a project around alternative energy and windmills. Go outside of the school building, actually into the community, and maybe do a small project and internship with that agency doing the work. Would be able to use both blended learning inside and outside of the classroom, using the technology, and to be able to personalize learning through a practical project to solve, say, a problem in the community, or to help go deeper and engage in that deeper learning where they are applying new skills, where they are identifying what the different academic standards are that they're covering. But this idea of going across subjects or integrating subjects using, we call it state standards, but it could be in other countries a national curriculum framework, to help get into bigger issues that matter and have those deeper holistic learning experiences. And maybe one other quick example, in the United Kingdom, in England, a Ulan school, students were asked to design a cell phone cover with a 3D printer. And Brian used several great examples with 3D printers. So they're using programming language. They're undertaking demonstration of math standards. They're using English standards. These students are designing cell phone covers, they're creating them, and then they're creating marketing materials as if they were going to launch this into some kind of a business effort. Well, what's blended is they're, again, finding the content, they're doing the materials, they're identifying the standards, they're doing the research, but it's a very personalized process for what they create and also for how they demonstrate that and what their end result looks like. Brian, I didn't know if you saw any other questions come up while I was doing that answer. If you wanted to add a little bit. These ideas do fit together like a Venn diagram, but there's a build to them, and I think the big goal is around personalized student-centered learning.
Yes. So the only thing I'll add real quick is if you take 3 practical problems of where kids are getting bullied on campus, if you take designing a professional learning schedule where teachers have Friday off and students are in an alternative schedule, if you take a common practical problem around how do you get more math support for the 3rd grade during a specials class, you use this slide. You begin to learn. You interview what people need, what some of the barriers are, challenges are. You developed a product like a schedule, a PowerPoint. You develop a concept map or an infographic, and then you test it. You go and share it with other people. You send it around on a quick digital loop for feedback, and then you execute, and you learn rapidly. We get caught up in schools and districts all the time of just working on the work. You have to be intentional about personalizing the experience for adults and also kids. And you can do it. You can do it as a principal, a classroom teacher, a superintendent, but it has to be a part of your workflow. So I would just encourage people with both practical small problems and larger problems, you have to decide to actually have a process to make it work. And that's what we're learning at all levels in our work across the country.
Thanks, Brian. And that's a nice way to wrap up. We're really have 1 minute left here, and I just wanted to thank everybody for participating. And if we didn't get to your question, we'll try to follow up directly or include some of these big ideas in our blog, education domains. Wanted to let you know that iNACOL is also hosting a Teacher Talk webinar. You can get the details on our website, inacol.org, on game-based learning later this month, and we'll be taking a look at the way that Minecraft is used educationally. There'll be a back-to-school webinar on September 10th on open educational resources with NROC. So again, thanks everyone for joining us. Please let us know how we may help serve your professional development needs in future webinars, and we hope to see you at the iNACOL Symposium in person November 8th through 11th in Orlando, Florida. I know I'll see you there, Brian, and many others who are in attendance today virtually on this webinar. So thank you, take care, enjoy the rest of your summertime, and good luck in your back-to-school ramp-up. Bye-bye.